Can I start by welcoming you all to this, our second Global Strategy Forum event of 2021. Our topic of conversation today is going to be the future of Britain post-Brexit, which I think is fairly timely given that we did manage to get the deal done just before New Year. It gives me great pleasure to be joined by two experts this morning, both of whom had exceptionally distinguished careers in government and indeed beyond that. I'm delighted also, they're both members of the GSF Advisory Board. So we are really at home today, if I can put it that way. Firstly, the Right Honourable Baroness Stuart of Edgbaston, who I think much more of as Gisela Stuart, who was a colleague in Parliament and with the House of Commons for many years. She's now the chair of Wilton Park and a non-executive board member of the Cabinet Office, and who in 2016, during the referendum, chaired the official Vote Leave campaign. So in terms of Brexit, she knows her onions. And then also another old friend of mine who was a close colleague for many years in the House of Commons, the Right Honourable Sir Malcom Rifkind QC, who was Foreign Secretary from 1995 to 97 and Secretary of State for Defence from 1992 to 1995. And perhaps if we do get onto the question of the integrity of the United Kingdom, it's even more relevant that he was the Secretary of State for Scotland for many years at the beginning of Margaret Thatcher's government. So Gisela and Malcolm, a warm welcome to you both. In talking about the future for the UK post-Brexit, I thought it'd be useful to focus on three key areas. Firstly, trade and our ongoing relationship with the EU 27. Secondly, our global Britain identity and the task of redefining our relationship both with our neighbours and with the rest of the world post-Brexit, and what the vision for our future global role should be. And thirdly, the effect of Brexit on the integrity of the United Kingdom. I hope these three topics will spark plenty of discussion amongst us. I'm sure they will. And of course, if we want to, we can range more widely. Our conversation today is about looking forward, but while I don't think any of us want particularly to revisit all the arguments of the past after the last 4 years, this doesn't mean we can't constructively and critically examine the present. I wanted to start by saying that since the referendum in June 2016, whatever we voted, whatever side we were on then, I think we can all agree that Brexit effectively dominated our national life. We had a turbulent 4.5 years of quite extraordinary political drama, deadlock and debate. We're now on our third Conservative Prime Minister since the referendum, 2 general elections after that as well. Deadlock and debate have governed really everything. And I think a year ago, at the beginning of 2020, with Boris Johnson newly elected as Prime Minister with an 80-seat majority, all of us probably anticipated that politically 2020 would be defined by Brexit as well. I think a year ago, at the beginning of 2020, that appeared to be the case. Since then, as we know, we suddenly found, which we obviously had not been able to take account of, the arrival of the deadly coronavirus pandemic, which has us all in its grip. And I may say from myself, thinking back over the last year, it's been very difficult to find any news anywhere in any newspaper or on television which didn't essentially talk about the pandemic, and I'm sure we'll touch on that as well. I think what I'd like to do, if I can, is to look at three areas and to deal with them. I don't want this just to be a question and answer session. I think it has to be more of a conversation. And so I'd like to start, if we could, with trade and our relationship with the European Union. We've now left the European Union. We do have a trade deal in place. There are many issues which I will come on to. I would like to ask both of you if you would sum up what you feel has been achieved in the last year. So starting with you, Gisela, what would you say has been our main achievements in terms of post-Brexit?
The fact that our leaving was in the end orderly and that we left on friendly terms. I thought that that last press conference with Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen was significant. It kind of showed a willingness on both sides to look at an ending and a beginning. In terms of the upheavals or benefits, it's actually quite tricky to separate Brexit and COVID and all the upheavals which we're going through. Many traders, in terms of their readiness, they want, the big companies wanted to be ready, but probably had fairly short notice. But what is just beginning to sink in is that the notion that you could have Brexit and actually say that that's what we were looking for without anything changing in the way we do things was never an aspirations. The one area where I do think we really need to do a lot more political work is in relation to Ireland. And I think, again, if I look at the political relationships, there's goodwill on both sides. I think the real big achievement is now that no one feels that Britain needs to be punished to show that leaving from the EU side is a bad idea. But even the EU is now beginning to look at saying, did some of our supply chains actually make sense? And for the UK, it means looking at a much more global level. It really is too early to kind of say, where's the good, where's the bad, but we left on good terms.
Do you think it's made Europe look more closely at itself? And where do you think that might lead to? Well,
I kind of feel that whether it's Brexit, whether it's COVID, or whether it's what happened in the United States of America with the fact that Trump was elected and what happened after that, it reminds me almost like that we are, as liberal democracies, going through a priestly play. They inspect the calls, and depending on where our individuals' weaknesses are, I think the United Kingdom's leaving, COVID, all those things are showing in each and every one of us where some of those weaknesses are. I don't think anybody should start indulging in Schadenfreude, because I don't think anybody's got perfectly the right answer. But I think the big challenges are going to be, how does the single currency zone not move to being a fiscal as well as a credit union, and therefore become a fully integrated United States of Europe? And that's their big challenge ahead.
Malcolm, what do you think has been the main movement in the last year?
Well, I think, first of all, that one of the consequences of our leaving the European Union is that many of the countries of the EU who had quite significant levels of Euroscepticism while we were a member no longer just can, as it were, withhold their criticism, expecting the UK to veto anything that they dislike or stop anything happening that they dislike. One of our great problems with the British public, I was a Remainer, one of our great problems with the British public was the assumption that people made that the United Kingdom's always alone, everyone's against you. Now, in fact, we know that quite a number of countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, but one or two in Scandinavia as well, had no greater interest than we had in moving towards some sort of federal EU state. I remember shortly after the Brexit referendum, I was in Tallinn in Estonia, and the Estonians were saying, oh, it's dreadful that you're leaving. We've been close allies of yours. And I said, yeah, sure, you've been great allies privately, but you've never been prepared to put your head above the parapet because you didn't want to annoy Berlin or Paris. And not just you, but the Poles, the Swedes, the Danes, and so forth, to varying degrees. So that is changing. And now you have an internal debate, which if it only had existed when we were still a member, it might have helped the referendum go the other way, because those who don't want to move, and it's quite clear, most of European opinion is at least unenthusiastic about much greater integration, to put it mildly. Now, on the question of trade, again, as a Remainer, I would point out, and I think Remainers ought to acknowledge this, that the exit from the EU has not been as traumatic as they feared or expected or predicted. And it's taken a long time. It's been pretty embarrassing in terms of our own domestic inability to reach a consensus as to what we actually wanted. But in terms of the impact on our economy and our trade, although it's been negative, nothing like the extent that some feared. And if you think, for example, of the City of London, the financial sector, they were predicting 100,000 jobs would disappear from London. It's at the 10,000 as we speak, and unlikely to get much greater. I think so far as the future, final point, as far as the future is concerned, I think you have to make a slight distinction between in terms of the amount of trade with the EU we do, between percentages and absolute trade. I think our absolute trade will increase because that will happen with Britain and the world as a whole, including the EU. But as a percentage, and it's been, 43% of our exports have gone to the EU, I think we should see that slowly declining as a percentage, partly because of global Britain initiatives, the trade deals we'll do with many other countries, but also it's a natural reaction of many hundreds and thousands of companies and businesses to avoid what might be the increased bureaucratic problems of exporting to the EU. They will be wanting to broaden and diversify their markets, and to some degree will have success.
I remember that David Frost, Lord Frost, the government's chief negotiator, called the last-minute trade deal one of the biggest and broadest agreements ever that would ensure that the UK, and I quote, sets its own laws again. And he went on to describe it as a moment of national renewal. Now, Malcolm, do you think this has been a moment of national renewal? Can you point to any?
I'm not sure about renewal. It's of national opportunity. I think we have to wait and see how much is renewed. And I think also, if I may be mildly critical of one particular issue at this very moment, we've had the nonsense of whether the EU ambassador in the UK should be given the full diplomatic status and protection that ambassadors have. And either the Foreign Office as an institution or Dominic Raab as Foreign Secretary, it's not clear which, are resisting that, although the EU has these rights in 140 countries around the world. No one else has questioned that. But we seem to be resisting it on the grounds that the EU is not a state. Well, of course it's not a state. It's not a state in the conventional sense. But it does have some of the characteristics of the state. If it didn't have, we wouldn't have been saying we've lost sovereignty. We need to have our sovereignty back. The EU does have sovereignty for its member states with the role of the European Court of Justice, with the implementation and domestic law of its own legislation, and a whole range of other issues. So I think it's pretty silly at this moment of all times for the Foreign Office or the Foreign Secretary, whoever it is, to, as it were, pick a row on a trivial point of protocol when it is already creating considerable resentment that Britain should be the only country in the world that questions us for actually pretty pathetic reasons.
Gisela, would you want to comment on that? I've heard it described as an own goal. I think the timing of it was quite extraordinary. Gisela, what do you think?
But also in principle, why, if you make the argument that, why we were leaving out of reasons, identity, community, and belonging in many ways. But it is still my view that those countries who are members of the Eurozone will have to take on more the markers of being a country. We have left. So that is the moment where you actually, not just magnanimity, but actually a reaching out. And it was a bit like when, after the referendum, I deeply regretted that we didn't start the negotiations by just offering the rights to EU citizens. You set the tone for future negotiations, and all I can hope for that this was just someone overlooked the importance of this decision. It was quite unnecessary.
Let's hope so. Things have changed a bit. We've made some progress, but if we're looking to the future, when we get a stable relationship with the European Union, I, like you, Gisela, was very pleased to see that we ended on a good and conciliatory note. But how long do you think it's going to be before we can have a reasonably well-balanced relationship without these sort of difficulties arising?
Oh, I think it'll be quite some time. You see, what I found very remarkable is that even in the United Kingdom, it wasn't until David Frost gave the speech in Bruges, which I think was in February, and this was a civil servant who actually absolutely articulated what the whole point of Brexit was. So what it meant to have left. And that big shift from the May years, when leaving was construed to leave as many of the existing things in place, to then when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister saying, well, you change things, that is the whole point of it. that kind of showed you that we ourselves had to think about this more carefully. And in the European Union itself, they're now facing those cores, the spendthrift and the frugal part of the European Union, who pays which bills, the outward-looking trading aspects of the United States. People are missing that. And the challenge for the Foreign Office, quite frankly, and for us generally, is that we have to re-establish meaningful bilateral relationships where we genuinely try to understand each other. Because I think a lot of that has gone wrong over the years. So I think this is 5-10 years.
Can I take a slightly divergent view? I don't broadly disagree with what Gisela is saying, but I think I want to make an additional point, if I may. And I think you have to make a distinction between what's likely to be our relationship with the European Union as an institution over the immediate future, and our bilateral relations with individual countries, particularly France and Germany. Now, with the EU, it may be difficult. For example, the protocol dispute I was mentioning a few moments ago, and there'll be other niggles of that kind, and people will be very sensitive about that. But in terms of our bilateral relationship, one doesn't have to make a prediction. One knows actually what's happened over the last 3 years, and perhaps the most important country for Britain is France or Germany, more or less equal. In the case of France, our bilateral relationship with France has improved more dramatically over the last 3 years, not because of Brexit, but regardless of it, than it has in any previous 3 years for the last 50, 60 years. And you only have to look at defense cooperation, where Britain and France are, within the European context, the two most important and the most credible military powers. We're the two countries with nuclear weapon status, and which could have been crucial if Trump had been re-elected and had sought to withdraw the nuclear support from Europe. Now, France and Britain, not just on nuclear weapons, but on a whole range of defense issues, have made more progress on cooperation than they have almost at any time in their history since the Entente Cordiale at the beginning of the 20th century. With Germany, our bilateral relations are very, very good. I mean, we had, for example, the Prince of Wales going to Germany and the President of Germany coming to our Remembrance Day services as acts of national reconciliation. And that was at the height of a lot of the ongoing Brexit disputes. And if one looks at our relationship with other countries, I can't think of a single example where our bilateral relationships with Scandinavia, with Eastern Europe, with the Mediterranean countries is either better or worse than it was 3 years ago. It's broadly been untouched. And that's not just out of mutual sentiment. It is ultimately because Britain, whatever its status, as either in the EU or outside it, is one of the big countries of Europe. Britain, France, and Germany are the three major powers. Britain has particular attributes which we're all familiar with, which I won't bother repeating. And countries want to have a close working relationship. And if we've chosen, for reasons of our own internal idiosyncrasy, to leave the EU, that does not inhibit them from wanting to develop as much as we're prepared to cooperate with them, they will with us. And so when we talk about global Britain, final point, when we talk about global Britain, there's a sort of assumption that means our relationship with every country outside the EU, in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Actually, we have to remind ourselves and other people that Europe, the countries of Europe who happen to be in the European Union, they will be at the receiving end of global Britain as much as maybe more because of their geographical and cultural proximity than almost any other country apart from the United States, perhaps, and Commonwealth countries. These have exceptional characteristics which are unique to the UK. But otherwise, global Britain includes Europe, it doesn't exclude it.
I don't disagree with Malcolm. I think the big challenge which is going to come our way is, if you go to the United States at the moment, they talk much about great power competition. And we have to decide, the United Kingdom, as a medium power, as to where we position ourselves. That combined with facing up to the fact that the thing which is special about the special relationship is actually the cooperation over the nuclear deterrent. That's where the incredible closeness comes from. And
intelligence, Five Eyes.
And Five Eyes. And on top of that, you have a NATO where the Europeans aren't really stepping up collectively to pay the bill for their own defense. And I don't think the United States will go on being prepared for that. So I think there's some really hard decisions coming up. And for the UK, given that we're going to be, G7, COP26, role on the Security Council, there is a chance to really project itself in a way. The problem we've got, someone described it to me yesterday. They said, we are high on strategic intent and low on strategic capability. The UK needs to not just express what it wants to happen. I think we need to check back home that we are actually capable of delivering those things.
Yeah. Just one point, Michael, before we return to our chair, but on this, I always like to ask a question when these sort of points are made, because when people say, well, the UK doesn't have that much power or capability or whatever, the question I would ask is, apart from obviously the United States and China, and at an economic level of Germany, of the 180 countries in the world, which countries have more capability than the United Kingdom? And the reality is that US is obviously, and China now, are in a class of their own. Russia has natural resources, but little else that is of interest to the wider world. Germany is the economic exception. But Britain and France, I would always combine the two because they're very similar in terms of their global position, both their history and their current capabilities. Who else? Who else in Europe? Who in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America compete? And if the answer is no one, at this moment, that may not be forever, but as we speak, then even very large countries like Japan or Brazil or India have minimal global capability, have minimal global diplomatic clout, and minimal military capability. So as we speak, and at least for the next 10, 20, perhaps 30 years, that position is not going to change. So the UK, and again, like France, we're not unique, can, as Douglas Hurd used to say, punch beyond our weight to a very significant degree. So I think this question of capability is often exaggerated.
It's very interesting. You mentioned, Malcolm, earlier, intelligence sharing. One intelligence sharing is that the three of us were all members of the Intelligence and Security Committee.
I hope that's not classified.
What struck me was, I've always seen this as a great strength of our position, is that we are in a unique position of being able to share intelligence which others find much more difficult to get. I think GCHQ is a very good example of that. But since we began to move away from Europe, we had people like Peter Ricketts, who was a former national security advisor, warning that cooperation would be slower and more clunky, if I can quote his actual words, through the loss of real-time data sharing, and our relationship with Europol and Eurojust will be more arm's length. And others have questioned whether we have actually weakened our position in terms of intelligence. Now, I don't think we have, but I'd like to hear what your view is.
Well, I think it's arguable and probably correct that the kind of intelligence, real-time information we got as members of the EU has declined, and therefore there's a price being paid for that. But it's not been a conscious decision saying, for political reasons, we're not prepared to share this information. It's simply been one of these automatic consequences that some of the intelligence and information sharing, you have to be an EU member to get it. And unless we reach a bilateral agreement with the EU, then we lose that.
That must work both ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, quite. And I'm just about to make a prediction. I bet you within a year to 18 months at most, we will have bilateral agreements which will return us to access to that information, because, as you rightly say, Michael, the EU will benefit by receiving the kind of intelligence the UK has. And there aren't many countries around the world, again, apart from the United States, that has that expertise and historical involvement in intelligence, accumulation, analysis, and willingness to share. And therefore, there is no self-interest reason why the EU should not, once the temperature's already getting better, but I say within 18 months, it may be much less than that. So I think the net effect in the longer term will be that we will continue to mutually share with the EU countries the information we shared as a member state relevant to serious crime, terrorism, matters of that kind. I think the more unpredictable question is whether there will be a willingness, not just by the UK, because the US is crucial in this, not to expand Five Eyes, I think that would be a mistake, but to create something comparable in terms of intelligence sharing with those EU countries, which aren't all of them, but there are one or two important EU countries who do have the same approach to confidentiality, to how you handle classified information, to whom you could trust to share intelligence information, dealing with counterterrorism and counter cyber attacks and issues of that kind. So that's going to be, I think, a real challenge. Not expanding formally Five Eyes, but developing something comparable for those EU countries that meet the standards required for handling that kind of material.
Gisela, what's your view of that? We were all on the Intelligence Committee. We saw this working. What do you think is the difference now?
I broadly agree with Malcolm's analysis that self-interest and mutual dependency will prevail, and you will end up with bilaterals. It will just take a little bit longer. But I want to take this a little bit wider, because there is something extraordinary about 2020-21. And it is a kind of challenging of all the things which we have taken for granted. I think for politicians looking ahead, whatever the problem is, the answer, but this is how we used to do it, is no longer valid, because so many of the variables have changed. And one of the big ones, what certainly for me was such a big surprise, was the threat to all the things we've taken for granted in liberal democracies, but coming from within, not from without. This assumption that when we talk about defense, that this is you protect yourself, external threats. I think that looking ahead when it comes to intelligence sharing, that the element of social cohesion, the element of what data society needs in order to function properly, is going to become really important. And with that, how do you handle that data? I mean, if I just take the beginning of the pandemic, I don't know whether you remember how everybody was telling us how in Germany, the Robert Koch Institutes were doing things so much better. And that is because they had internal data of local government structures, whereas now we are seen as really being ahead on the rollouts of vaccines, because the NHS has kind of data which is much more integrated through the whole country. So I think the question of security in some ways, and where threats are coming from, and to what extent the public consents to those, and the responsible exercise of that, I think that debate is going to shift. And I think it's a healthy debate, which we should welcome, but it will be at times an uncomfortable one.
I mean, just again, if we could just move on from there to the general view, we've touched on it already, of global Britain as a concept. It's interesting when you see how many capabilities, as Malcolm said, we have in Britain, how we can use those best. And, maybe we can look at that for a moment. We retain our seat on the United Nations Security Council. We are a major global economy, all these things which are major advantages. Early this month, Dr. Robin Niblett of Chatham House suggested the concept of global Britain should be global broker. And he posits the best way forward for us to remain internationally influential is to serve as the broker of solutions to global challenges. This interested me because for some time I have been arguing that we should be looking closely at any role we might be able to play in terms of international conciliation, which I think is one of the strengths we have. And I look across the North Sea at Norway. Norway has built itself an extraordinary position in terms of international reconciliation. almost every country I visited when I was Shadow Foreign Secretary, where there was conflicts going on, there was a Norwegian ambassador who was busy bringing people together behind the scenes in order to have talks. And I began to wonder whether this wasn't something we could do very well as a country ourselves. And adding to that, if you allow me to just for a moment, David Howell's great vision of the internet, of the internal working of the internet, bringing all countries together, seems to me something we could also look to build on. Malcolm, what do you think?
Well, in principle, I'm strongly in agreement with what you're saying. But when somebody with a political background says in principle, you know what in practice that's going to lead to. Straight out of Westminster and Sir Humphrey. However, there are certain problems. And you see, you used Norway as a very good example of a country that has had a strong role and successful role in conciliation. Switzerland could be another example. In the Middle East, Qatar, a tiny country, has done a lot of mediation, successful mediation work over the years. But the point I'm making is it's precisely because they're actually very small countries that don't have grand ambitions that they are trusted in a mediation role. If you get a country like France or the United Kingdom or America or whatever offering a mediating role, most of the people whom you're hoping to mediate for are very nervous because they assume, rightly or wrongly, that you have another agenda. You know, as a country with a global foreign policy, you're trying to get something out of this. And sometimes they're right. So I'm not convinced that mediation, I have nothing against it. And if I'm wrong, I'll only be too delighted. But I'm not convinced that the beneficiaries of mediation would see the UK or France or Germany or United States or whatever as mediators. We're players, some of us more modest than others. If I could just make one additional point in regard to global Britain and so forth. I think the question we should always ask is not just what can we do well or where we have experience or ambition, it's where we provide added value. And I just want to use one example, but I think a very important example. We happen to have one of the largest defense budgets in the world. And we all know that even with a very large defense budget, we still have big problems as to capability and how we use this defense budget. I think where the United Kingdom can make a unique contribution, both for Europe and for NATO, and with regard to what's happening in the Far East with China, is maritime. It so happens traditionally our naval strength has been what made the United Kingdom different to most other countries because we were an island, because of empire, because of trade and so forth. And even today, and particularly taking into account the unexpected increase in the defense budget, the fact we already have the two carriers, we have a naval nuclear deterrent, and we're going to have increased numbers of frigates and destroyers. It'll still be miles behind the United States. But again, I come back to the point, apart from the United States and now China, the United Kingdom will be the third, a long way behind them, but it will be the third maritime global power. And because we have, I'm always astonished how much of our trade is in the Far East. Something like 60% of our trade goes through these choke points and Singapore, Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea and so forth. So we have a strategic interest from an economic and trade point of view, not just diplomatic and political. So I make the point that our maritime capability, there's virtually no other countries in the world apart from the US and China who are going to be able to compete with that. Russia does have something significant. France has something significant, but not in a global sense that we can offer. And that's added value. And it's also highly relevant to expanding links with the Commonwealth. On this, I strongly agree with David Howell that the Commonwealth is also an area, not for power play, but essentially soft power. I mean, that's cultural, it's soft power, it's trade and so forth, varying from country to country. But, who else has this network of 5 countries who have chosen to remain post-imperial within this links with the United Kingdom? Final point on this, if I may. We are going through a long lot of debate about whether our empire was something we should be proud of or something we should be embarrassed by and apologize for. Well, we all know that all empires must have been based on aggression and expansion and the desire to dominate weaker parts of the world. We all know that's always been true. But what is extraordinary, if it had been as bad as some imply, would 54 of the countries that were part of our empire continue to be not only in the Commonwealth, but accepting our head of state as the head of the Commonwealth and the next king of the United Kingdom as the next head of the Commonwealth? Why would they do that if this was a disgraceful part of their history? And the reality is there are only two significant countries that didn't join the Commonwealth. One was Ireland, and the other was the United States. So that's a pretty impressive record. The French have nothing to compare with that as the other major imperial power. So let's get this in perspective. There were a lot of terrible things that happened, but they can't have all been terrible. Otherwise, all these 50 countries would have been not remotely interested in maintaining their involvement with our head of state and with the United Kingdom, with the Secretariat based in London.
Yeah, I mean, David Howell, if Gisela, I put this to you, David Howell sort of had even wider concept of what he called the network world, was that communication is no longer vertical because of networks and the internet. People communicate at all levels sideways. And this was a moment when he wanted to somehow encompass that in a way that could be used valuably for the world. And he made the point that not only are the 54 countries that Malcom mentioned in the Commonwealth, but also some of the biggest, India, for instance, not a minor nation anymore, and it's certainly going to be a great influence, I think, in the future. South Africa, Canada, there seems to be a potential there, and you may see this through the work you're doing at the moment, of bringing these together in a way that can actually use their own influence within the world.
I think two things happened within the UK which support your argument. One is when the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab started to use the phrase "a force for good," you could sort of sense the political thing that, was everyone else comfortable with this phrase? And it sort of waned for a little bit, but it is firmly back as an aim of how we project our foreign capabilities. And if I look at the new department which was created, the Foreign and Development Office, FCDO, it is not just a bringing together of two departments. It is an attempt to create something new, which uses the strategic way which DFID had always operated, because he was essentially a commissioner and always looked at much more wider and long-term aspects, with the presence and the capability of the Foreign Office. And when you look historically at the spending we had on the Foreign Office, I think it's been grossly underfinanced. So that together, I think, will provide what David Howell seems to suggest and what you seem to suggest, Michael, a greater ability to work on conflict prevention, to work on reconciliation. I think that the integrated review, when it finally does see the day of light, will very much play into those kind of national strengths and supporting it. But for me, I think COP26 and G7 at a time when people can't travel or where travel is very limited is to me the perfect opportunity, where you do arrange events in our high commissions, in our embassies, in the regional ones, across time zones, to feed into those kind of global gatherings, where we kind of orchestrating them, the conductors of it. And to me, that's where the future must be. And we could play a very, very significant part. Can I just add one other thing, because you were mentioning my Cundler. So Wilton Park, we had our advisory council meeting this week, and someone came up with an idea which I really liked, and it said, why don't we do more helping countries implement their own laws which they've already passed? So when it comes to whether it's now environmental or other global obligations, where countries have already passed the legislation, so you're not imposing any of them, but there may be a kind of lack of capacity to implement. And I think you can do a lot of those things without falling foul of what I think Malcom quite rightly identified, that suspicion which great countries create compared to when a smaller country comes at at having, offering help. So I'm hopeful that there is a chance to do that, but we just have to become a bit more strategic in the way we lay down these plans, because it's got to go over a number of years, and it won't be happening from just by tomorrow.
Just on that point, I traveled quite a lot in the Middle East, and it always interested me how many Arab countries said to me, "Why can't you be more involved in Middle East policy, foreign policy?" Because your country knows more about the Middle East than any of the other countries that are trying to resolve the issues here. And I always thought we did miss opportunities there. Malcolm, I don't know whether you feel that from your time as Foreign Secretary.
Well, I do, but I'd be a bit cautious when your Arab friends tell you that, because not only is it a compliment, it is also will be followed by the fact, but of course you are responsible for most of the problems in the Middle East, precisely because of your historic involvement. So we are deemed to be responsible for the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Because of what happened during the mandate and the Balfour Declaration. We're deemed to be responsible for Kashmir because we allowed India to be replaced by India and Pakistan and without resolving that issue. We've been involved in the Iraq War, and Tony Blair was one of the two people most responsible for that. So it's a slightly barbed compliment. And the Iranians have never forgiven us for helping get rid of Mossadegh, the former Iranian prime minister of the 1950s. And I don't blame them.
But some of the people I spoke to used to take exactly that precise argument and turn it the other way, saying, "We don't like you, you did terrible things to us, but you were here. Therefore, you actually understand how this place works."
That's a good point. Yeah, I do go along with that. Yeah, that is an entirely fair comment, because there is a lot of ignorance and disinterest in learning about the nature of Middle Eastern history, of Arab history, of the culture of the country and the values of the country. And I mean, the problem with Blair, forgive me, was that he didn't listen to his own advisors, either in the Foreign Office or elsewhere, who did understood what happens if you send an army into Iraq and get rid of the current regime there. I go along with that. I think you make a good point.
Gisela, have you got anything to add on that?
No, except that just politically, if you think the journey we made, that after the intervention in the former Yugoslavia, which was deemed to be good, and then we had Sierra Leone, and even in the United Nations, we started talking about duty to protect. We kind of had this very hopeful that it can bring about real change. We then ended up with 20 years of the very same people who will argue that Iraq was wrong to have intervened will give you the same hard time of saying it was wrong that we did not intervene in Syria. And they're not quite sure about what we should have done in Libya. And in foreign policy and political discussions, I think we are in a weird space that, whatever anybody actually does, we afterwards sort of say you should have done the other. And I think there is a moment where we probably have to become more articulate of what we think we would deploy troops for, what we think when we say we are force for good, what do we think good is? And again, face up to the fact that all these things are really, really long term. I think what the last 20 years have told us, or even if you look at Iraq, probably the most disastrous decision in Iraq was not the invasion. It was the behavior immediately after the invasion, the kind of complete destruction of the infrastructure. So this generation of politicians has got a real challenge that they need to engage more in foreign policy and shaping it and what they think defense should deliver. And I think we are intellectually quite weak on that at the moment. And there's an intellectual capacity I think we have to build on to have these kind of informed debates.
I think also, I don't know whether you agree with this. I mean, you were asking, what the force for good, what is good? Good is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And the trouble is you can persuade yourself that overthrowing Saddam is good, and therefore you justify everything you do as a result of it. And that isn't necessarily always the case.
Yeah, but I think there are some things which we probably can agree on that they're good. Eradicating malaria, now the kind of the vaccinations programs, even if it's just kind of information exchange. There are some global institutions which I think we we have allowed to weaken. And this is, coming back to where we started, which is sort of Brexit. There's a question of, you have national institution where you've got a demos and a belonging and a responsibility. And then I think you need global institutions, which you have to give some powers to. But the real question is, to what extent are those supranational institutions, which is what the EU was, what is their role and what is their place? And my hunch is that it's not as successful as people thought. There was an overreach there. But we certainly have to pay attention to our global institutions, because I think they have been neglected.
Yeah, that could be another whole debate we might have some other time. I just wondered, the time we've got left, we're about 3/4 of the way through our allotted time. I mentioned at the beginning the integrity of the United Kingdom. And in a sense, the reason that this relates to Brexit is, in the referendum, the United Kingdom showed very different reactions to the concept of leaving the European Union. And you had Wales and England voting very strongly to stay, and you had Scotland and Northern Ireland voting the other way. I don't know whether you feel that this is part of the reason why we're now seeing the United Kingdom rather more fragile than it has been in the past, and whether we should be considering how we mend that.
Well, if I may comment on that, yes, it is certainly true that the Scottish nationalists have been able to use as a pretty powerful political argument. Scotland voted to stay in, and its views were ignored, is the way it's presented. But actually, I think it's a bogus argument, because it implies that this is a sort of north-south issue. The reality is there were two major parts of the United Kingdom that voted to remain, almost exactly the same numbers. One was, of course, London. So London and Scotland happened to have a 60% odd vote in favour, and most of the rest of the UK voted the other way. But even within Scotland, it's worth remembering that almost 40% of Scots, 38% to be exact, voted to leave, which is not an insignificant minority. And what is most fascinating, when the research was done, they discovered that of SNP supporters and members, 1 in 4 voted to leave. Quite logically, they said, we want to be independent. And we don't just want to be independent of London, we want to be independent of Brussels as well. So, a quarter of the nationalists were Brexiteers. So it's not as simple as it's been presented. But on the wider question you asked, Michael, about where we are now, you can actually almost put Brexit on one side. Not really, but in terms of the overwhelming importance of the broader issue, the issue is the choice only going to be between the status, for Scotland, between the status quo and Scottish independence? And whether we like it or not, if that was the choice, and we may be able to see a referendum deferred indefinitely, in which I have no problem with that, but if that proves to be increasingly difficult over the years, then at some stage, some kind of referendum may be required. Now, the point I want to make is that what has changed dramatically, regardless of Brexit, and we've seen this during the pandemic, is that devolution is now seen not as unsuccessful, but as inadequate. And why is that? Because devolution is the centre, namely London, graciously decentralising power, lending it to Scotland, to Wales, to Northern Ireland, to the regions of England. But what is devolved can be returned very easily, as we saw when the Northern Irish Assembly was simply suspended by a vote in the House of Commons on an ordinary method. Now, what we have seen, which is unique since 1707, is the terminology that is now being used, not just in Edinburgh, but in London and in Cardiff and in Belfast. And what am I referring to? I'm referring to the Four Nations. And that used to be something you only ever used for rugby internationals. And then during the pandemic, it has increasingly been used because it so happens by chance health is a devolved responsibility, and therefore the way in which the pandemic is being addressed, not just in Scotland, but in Wales, Northern Ireland, as we've seen, is very different in some respects to England. So the phrase Four Nations has now caught the public imagination. And I've heard it, as you will have heard it, used not just in relation to COVID, but in relation now to the debates about the future of the Union. How are we going to deal with the four nations? Now, what that says to me is we actually have to reinvent the Union. That the Union, which was essentially, to start off with, a unitary state based in London, and then in recent years has involved devolution, we need to actually look at the whole constitution of the United Kingdom. And on this, I agree with a number of people who've spoken on these matters, including Gordon Brown. And I think that what you need to do is, in a sense, turn the Union the other way around, so that what we start off with, what we create is a new Union where the four nations have decided to give power to a UK government, not just on foreign policy and defence, but on other things which make sense for an island state, including the internal market, including the currency, including the strategic economic judgments. But everything else is done by the four nations, England having to discuss within England how it wants to handle it, as a single English unit or in some other decentralised way. Now, I know it's not as simple as that, but what I would hope is that the British government will not wait until after whatever happens in Scotland at the Scottish elections to the SNP. The British government has to take the initiative and actually has to initiate a United Kingdom study of the future of the Union, which will probably take a year or so to do. But not only is that necessary in constitutional terms, it's also a pretty smart way of dealing with the demands that Sturgeon will make for another referendum if the SNP win the Scottish elections. Because it's one thing just to say, no, you can't for 40 years. It's another thing to say, look, it would be absurd to have a referendum. We have already launched a constitutional review of the United Kingdom. It's going to take a year or so. That's not that long in historical terms. And a year from now, 18 months from now, we will see whether we come up with new proposals so that the choice, not just for Scotland, but for the rest of the Union as well, is not just independence or the status quo, but there is a third option which will have to be put into the equation. I'm oversimplifying it in terms of the time I've got to make these comments, but that is, I think, essentially the big challenge now that Brexit is, broadly speaking, behind us, and hopefully COVID will be behind us at least in a few months' time. That's the one that's really going to dominate our politics for the next 2 or 3 years, at least.
I think I can hear a campaign beginning to launch itself in your mind.
Correct.
Gisela, what is your reaction to that?
Well, Malcolm, welcome to the Constitution Reform Group. I mean,
Sure.
we gathered in 2015, which was before the referendum.
Absolutely acknowledge.
The divisions were becoming quite obvious to me, and I'm now going to say something very heretical, and that is, I think it's quite a mistake to look at this through the prism of Scotland and Wales. I think the problem is England. And as you know, I grew up in a federal state, Bavaria, twice the size of Scotland, one of 15 lender. But the presumption in the United Kingdom are different. It's because historically the powers are so centralized. But the point I would make, I went through the other day the whole history of referendums, and you go on with the first one in the 70s in Northern Ireland. You then have several in Wales, you have them in Scotland. And at every stage of those, the call for more power being locally based actually increases quite considerably. And then you look at England, where we had elections on regional mayors. In the case of Birmingham, we had one where the ballot paper was so complicated. When I looked at it, and I was campaigning for a directly elected mayor, I was looking at the paper 3 times and saying, so which box do I tick? Because he was phrasing it along the cabinet style mayor or what have you. And then we just imposed the regional mayor anyway afterwards. We created crime and police commissioners without asking. So I think it's not just the structure of the United Kingdom generally and how England governs itself specifically. I also think we need to take a very good look at ourselves, at how we involve the public. We can't just say, we ask you when it suits us, and we don't ask him when it doesn't suit us. But I'm actually very confident that this sort of the oldest of all unions survives. But the challenge, and there you're absolutely right, Malcolm, the challenge for the government is not just reinvent, but also re-articulate. So I think the UK Prosperity Fund is a step there. I think the city deals are a step towards that greater devolution. The UK Internal Market Bill was a step there. But the challenge is for England to learn to articulate that it too benefits from the union. We can't just go on and seeing that through the prism of the Barnett formula, because if the EU referendum taught us one thing, this is not about economic decisions. Economic decisions support other decisions, but if that is your only basis for the foundation of that new structure, you will fail. And I would urge over the next sort of period for, just a recognition of the contributions, for example, Scotland makes. We talked about defence. Just think on the strategic position of Scotland itself, the way it supports, the troops, all those things. Not just always say, we create jobs in the defence industry in Scotland. That is not sufficient. It does require a re-articulation and a refounding of the union. And I think that is perfectly possible.
What is the mechanism for getting there?
Well, I think there's various mechanisms for getting. It's both a question of timing and its mechanism. Now, ideally, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, I would like to see the United Kingdom government saying something along the lines Gisela and I have been talking about before the Scottish elections. So it's not, because the United Kingdom government ought to be taking the initiative, not just responding to a political development in Scotland that is to the benefit of the SNP. We used to, in the old days, have things called royal commissions, and it was famously said the royal commissions take minutes and last years. And I don't think you want to use that term, royal commission. But what you basically want to see, I think, is what I'd like to see is Boris Johnson not committing himself to a particular model for the future. That's premature. But saying we recognise we are now a union of 4 nations. We recognise that although devolution is working administratively pretty well, it isn't meeting the aspirations, not just of a lot of people in Scotland, but it appears in Wales and parts of England and Northern Ireland as well. Therefore, we are going to have, over the next year, 18 months, a constitutional inquiry combined with a national debate, a UK debate, on the kind of union that will meet the aspirations of the 4 nations. And then he should set that up. And because it would take, to do its job properly, at least a year to 18 months, but it should be given a requirement to report not later than that. So this can all be considered within the context of the parliament that we're in at the moment. Then that is not only, as I mentioned earlier, a marvellous way of saying to the SNP, look, your question of a referendum is infinitely premature, quite apart from whether there's good or bad arguments for it. So you buy time is a rather crude way of putting it, but you don't buy time and then end up where you started. You end up, hopefully, with a serious proposal for a kind of union of the United Kingdom that is that respects the identity of the 4 nations. And Gisela rightly said that we can't do it like the Brexit referendum, rely on economics alone. Economics alone are inadequate. This, like Brexit, is about identity. And the most interesting and worrying, disturbing thing, if you look at Scotland at the moment, is not that a majority of people are hostile to the United Kingdom. They're not hostile. There are nationalists who are, but the people we're talking about who may have changed their views in the last 10, 15 years are not hostile. What is happening is they are becoming indifferent to that part of their identity, which is British. They're not hostile to it, but their Scottishness is becoming so much more important. Whereas until relatively recently, most of us, I'm sure the 3 of us would say, I'm British and I'm Scottish, and I don't choose one more than the other. They're both important parts of my identity. That's happening less often in Scotland, and to a lesser degree in Wales, and to a lesser degree in England, interestingly enough. And that's the most disturbing thing, but it can be dealt with. I agree with Gisela's optimism. I think if we actually handle it in a sufficiently strategic way, not tinkering with trying to persuade the Scots how much better they are financially and what English taxpayers do. All that sort of stuff goes down like a Led Zeppelin. But there are more serious, mature ways of responding to the aspirations that are being expressed.
Gisela, you never know. You were on the European Constitutional Convention. You may end up on the United Kingdom Constitutional Convention as well, which would be a real unique position to hold. Sadly, we've run
you
out
were my friend, Michael.
Sorry?
I said you were my friend.
Imagine what your enemies might be saying.
Anyway, thank you.
Who needs enemies?
Thank you very much. I think it's been a very interesting discussion. I had one last question, but I don't think I've got time to ask it. You'll have to wait for another occasion. But thank you for coming along. Thank you for taking part in this discussion. It's one that's going to go on and on and on. So I'm sure we'd all be back again before long. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.